There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort. It is the exhaustion of a mind that never stops. A mind that takes a simple conversation and runs it through 1,000 possible interpretations. That receives a piece of good news and immediately begins calculating what could go wrong. That lies awake at 2 in the morning not because anything is wrong, but because the brain has found a question it cannot leave alone and will not rest until it has examined every possible answer. Even when no answer is actually available, even when the question itself does not matter, even when the person attached to that brain knows, with perfect clarity, that the thinking is not helping. This is not a character flaw. This is not a failure of discipline or willpower. This is the psychology of overthinking, one of the most common and most misunderstood patterns in human mental life. Overthinking is not the same as thinking carefully. This distinction gets collapsed constantly, and the confusion causes real damage. Careful thinking is deliberate, directed, and productive. It takes a problem, examines it from relevant angles, arrives at useful conclusions, and stops. Overthinking does none of these things. It circles. It returns. It generates new angles not because they are useful, but because the mind has not yet found the feeling of certainty it is searching for. And that feeling, for the overthinker, is extraordinarily difficult to reach. The thoughts are not moving toward resolution. They are moving in loops, driven not by the genuine complexity of the problem, but by an underlying anxiety that the thinking is trying and failing to resolve. Psychologists who study rumination, the clinical term for the repetitive, self-focused thinking that characterizes overthinking, have found that it is one of the most reliable predictors of anxiety and depression in the research literature. Not because thinking is inherently dangerous, but because rumination is a specific kind of thinking that is fundamentally disconnected from action. It creates the feeling of doing something about a problem while actually preventing the kind of engagement that would help. The overthinker is not lazy. They are, in a very real sense, working constantly. But the work is circular, and the circle has no exit. Consider a woman named Clara, a 34-year-old project manager who describes her inner life with the exhausted precision of someone who has been fighting the same battle for 20 years. She is, by external measures, exceptionally capable. Her colleagues trust her judgment. Her projects run on time. She is the person others come to when they need someone to think through a difficult situation carefully. But inside, in the hours between work and sleep, in the gaps between one task and the next, her mind operates on an entirely different register. A casual comment from a friend becomes material for 3 hours of analysis. A decision she made 2 years ago returns at unpredictable intervals for fresh examination. An email she sent this morning will be reconsidered tonight, not because anything went wrong, but because her mind cannot locate the certainty it needs to let the thing go. What drives this pattern? Psychologists have identified several interconnected factors, and they paint a picture that is both more complicated and more compassionate than the common assumption that overthinkers simply need to think less. One of the most consistent findings is the relationship between overthinking and a low tolerance for uncertainty. The human mind, in general, finds uncertainty uncomfortable. We are prediction machines. Our brains are constantly generating models of what will happen next, and when those models cannot be completed, when the future refuses to resolve into clear outlines, the discomfort can become almost physical. For most people, this discomfort is tolerable. They make their best guess, accept the remaining uncertainty, and move on. For overthinkers, the discomfort of unresolved uncertainty is significantly more intense, and the thinking is an attempt, ultimately futile, to think their way to certainty before acting. There is also a profound connection between overthinking and perfectionism. People who hold high standards for themselves and for their decisions find it genuinely difficult to accept that most decisions are made with incomplete information, that good enough is often the best available option, and that the cost of continued deliberation frequently exceeds the cost of an imperfect choice. The overthinker is not being irrational when they continue to analyze. From their internal perspective, they are being responsible, making sure they have considered every angle, protected every vulnerability, anticipated every possible consequence. The problem is not the intention but the execution, because no amount of thinking can manufacture certainty where none exists. and the pursuit of it through more thinking is a loop with no natural ending. The neuroscience of overthinking reveals something important about why it is so difficult to simply stop. Brain imaging studies of people who are engaged in rumination show heightened activity in the default mode network, the system that activates during self-referential thought, when the mind is not focused on an external task, but is turned inward, thinking about itself, its past, its future, its relationships. This network is sometimes called the resting state of the brain, but for overthinkers it is anything but restful. It is a hyperactive system that generates thoughts continuously, that connects current concerns to past experiences and future anxieties with a speed and associative richness that can feel completely beyond voluntary control. And in a very real sense it is. The decision to stop overthinking cannot be made simply by deciding to stop, any more than the decision to stop feeling anxious can be made simply by deciding to feel calm. The social consequences of overthinking are both significant and frequently invisible to the people around the overthinker. Relationships suffer in specific ways. The overthinker reads too much into neutral communications, a brief reply, a change in tone, a canceled plan, and constructs elaborate interpretations that have no basis in the other person's actual experience. They rehearse conversations before having them and replay them after, looking for evidence of how they were received. They apologize for things that did not require apology, and then wonder if the apology itself was wrong. They seek reassurance in ways that can feel burdensome to partners and friends who cannot understand why the same reassurance needs to be given again the following week when nothing has changed. The overthinker is not trying to be difficult. They are trying to manage an internal experience that is genuinely exhausting, using the only tool that feels available. What actually helps, and the research on this is more hopeful than the experience of overthinking might suggest, is not more thinking but a fundamental shift in the relationship between the person and their thoughts. Cognitive behavioral approaches that have shown the most consistent effectiveness are not those that try to argue overthinkers out of their thoughts, but those that help them change their relationship to the thinking itself. The thought is not the truth. The thought is not a command. The thought is not evidence of anything beyond the fact that the brain has generated it. Learning to observe thoughts rather than inhabit them, to notice that the mind is looping without boarding the loop, is a skill that can be developed, and its development changes the experience of overthinking at a level more fundamental than any amount of trying to think better thoughts. The people who overthink everything are not broken. They are people whose minds are working overtime in the service of goals that are genuinely understandable, to be safe, to be prepared, to be good, to avoid failure, to protect the people they love. The tragedy of overthinking is not its intention, but its method. The certainty it seeks cannot be found through more thinking, and the safety it promises is always just one more thought away. What these people most need is not an answer to the question their mind keeps asking. It is permission to act without one. Permission to step forward into the uncertainty that every human life requires, trusting not that everything will go perfectly, but that they are capable of handling whatever actually happens. That trust, built slowly through experience rather than thinking, is the one thing overthinking can never provide, and the one thing that actually sets the mind free.